Azure Deep Dive with Greg Leonardo.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for the past episodes and show notes. And boy, do we have a lot, racking them up now. And I'm really excited about what we just saw at the Microsoft Build Conference. All those videos, all that content's available on Channel 9. Go online, search it up. It's easy to find, and watch that stuff. It's helping a lot of people. A lot of new stuff. New version of Visual Studio out, 16.6. A lot of new stuff with VS Code. A lot of new stuff everywhere. Microsoft is just rocking and rolling. Blazor WebAssembly is GA, so production ready, not just Blazor server side. So that's pretty cool. And the goal of this podcast is for all development teams to be able to move fast, deliver quality, and run their systems with confidence. And so we bring on guests and topics to enable that. And today I'm really excited to have Greg Leonardo back on the podcast. Greg is currently a cloud architect helping organizations with cloud adoption and innovation. And he's been working in the IT industry since his time in the military. He's a developer, teacher, speaker, and early adopter. He's worked in many facets of IT throughout his career. Currently the president of TampaDev, a community meetup that runs hashtag TampaCC, a Azure User Group, the Azure Medics, and various other technology events throughout Tampa that he's the leader of. So, Greg, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm great. It's a great day in Central Texas. And how is it in Florida?
The same, hot.
The same.
I don't think we're quite as humid as you, but we may be getting there.
Yeah. Well, I know some of the beaches are opening back up. Some of the Texas beaches are open back up, and I don't know about you guys, but in Texas, the beaches are just there. There's no concept of lifeguard. It's just, hey, if you want to walk to the ocean, there's a stretch of it.
Yep, that's about how we are because we got it on all sides. So you just walk there and you're good to go. Well,
I mean, can you imagine how much budget it would take to even think about putting lifeguards at every stretch of beach coastland? That's just not going to happen.
Yep.
So, hey, if you want to walk into the ocean, there it is.
Exactly.
So awesome. Well, your book is doing really well, Building Solutions in Azure. What is it, October that it was put out?
It was October of last year. Little labor of love. Probably going to look at sometime, in the next 6 months or so to maybe do some rewriting on it and get some other new facets in, like Azure Arc and a couple of the other new features and architecting solutions in Azure. But one of the things I've been doing since that time is I also helped co-wrote a Azure Strategy and Implementation guide for Microsoft that went over the architecture and DevOps portion of Azure and some things that you can do in it. It's actually free, so anybody can go out there and get it from Microsoft's Azure site. So
that's awesome. And we're going to include a link to that in the show notes. But what should they search for if they're just putting in some search terms?
I believe it's they can search it up under Azure Strategy and Implementation Guide. And if you put 3rd edition, which is what it is, it probably shrink it down a little bit. But yeah, it's out on the Microsoft's Azure site under their resources. So they should be able to find it either way.
Okay. Awesome. You're a pretty prolific writer and speaker. I think at was it Microsoft Ignite? You were on one of the technology military panels?
Yes, it actually was. It was a very good time to share some of the experiences. I had some big shoes to fill for filling in for you. So
I think I glanced at the recording, and it's available with all the other Ignite content. So it's pretty awesome. So let's dive into Azure. I mean, you are one of the few people who does not work at Microsoft that's gone just absolutely super deep on what you can do with Azure. But we were talking, and one of the super common scenarios is just what should be, and at some point will become the basics of running your application in Azure. There's we talk so much about deploying an application into Azure, but then you got to run it, and Azure offers the promise of the automated cloud. And so we want essentially a situation where, okay, it's in Azure, and I really do have it configured properly so that I can trust that it's running and healthy. And at some point, somebody's not going to say, hey, it's having problems or it's down. And you go and say, oh, shoot, I didn't even know. How did that happen?
Right. And I think that's a lot of the issues currently with today is a lot of people think they just upload this stuff to the cloud and it magically works. And somebody, there's a little Dobby the house elf running around making your services come up and keeping them up. But at the end of the day, a lot of organizations start figuring out that they need to monitor these things. And they need to change what their purview is in that monitoring. And really what their purview is into locking it down. Just because you put it in the cloud doesn't mean it's secure. It's going to be as secure as you make it, just like with anything else, because Azure's a bolt-on service, right? So everything that you want to do, you can put a website out there. It doesn't make it secure. If you want security, you do this. You put a WAF on it. You segment out your databases. What do you mean?
The acronym WAF?
WAF, Web Access Firewall. Or web application firewall, I think is the proper terminology. But basically, it's accessing your application. So what it does is it puts up an application firewall, allowing it not to be exploited. It does tracking and blocking and a whole bunch of different things that you need to do in order to protect your app from an automatic perspective. That's not done when you just throw things out in the web, off on your own, because Microsoft doesn't view it that way. So it really depends from an organization perspective how you need to secure your data. And still some of the standard practices as we've seen, from an internal perspective are there as well. We always used to hide your databases behind a firewall, used to make a DMZ, used to do all these different things. You still do these different things. It's just that your visibility into how you do them has changed and who's responsible for them has changed. You don't need to be responsible for that hardware anymore. You just need to be responsible for the action of putting that hardware in place. So it's kind of just a different purview, as they say.
Let's grab a sample architecture just so we can ground everybody as we talk through this. I imagine that amongst other software, probably every listener has at least one application that has a .NET web application of some sort and a SQL Server database. And then they probably add on other like an offline batch job or backend whatnot. But everybody seems to have those components. So let's just even if it's not 100%, if it's not high 90s, whatever. All right, so we got Azure Web App, and then we got Azure SQL. That would be the kind of the default choices, unless people are moving to containers for some reason. But I think it's a little early for that for those types of things. So. Let's piggyback off of that. You mentioned the firewall, and suppose someone said, you know what, all my users are really local, and even if I have some family members that are kind of out of state, I really don't cater to anybody that's not U.S., not my own country. So if I think about it, anybody coming from halfway around the world, they're not my customer, and should we just be auto blocking them? Azure doesn't do that by default. So how do you think about that? And is there a default configuration where you say, hey, only let people in my country access this?
Well, first off, Azure is an open platform, right? So you put it out there, there is no shutting it down, okay? You put it out there, it's what we refer to as in the public, right? You and I used to call it that, it's a DMZ zone. There's nothing we can do to shut it down. Anybody can come into it. Anybody can do whatever they want with it. So a lot of people need to understand that
DMZ,
that's what you need to do.
Demilitarized zone.
Right, demilitarized zone is our old days. But,
well, even civilians, called it DMZ. So that's just, it's a cool term.
So, but the funny thing about it is that's the whole thing. When you put it out there, the way I always say is when you put stuff out there, think of it like you're putting it into the public and you have no say in the matter. So you can't pick and choose. Now, if you want to pick and choose who has to see your site, then you have to put other things in play. That's what your WAFs are for. That's what your traffic managers are for. Those are all of the appliances that go around it, right? So, but a lot of people don't understand that that's kind of what they did when they housed their own servers anyway. They always thought, well, I just put a firewall up and I put it on my own network, so only the people that I want to see it can see it, but everybody around the world could see it.
Yeah.
They just didn't think of it in that realm. But it goes to the cloud, and then they're like, well, wow, everybody can see it. And it's like, well, everybody could see it before. You just weren't thinking in that arena.
Okay, so what should people do if they say, you know what, I really only want people in my country to be able to even to get to this? What's the best way for them to set that up properly?
Well, you've got several folds. So you can do it a bunch of different ways. If it's a WordPress site, you can do it through software configurations like a word fence or a software application that you could use to block the IPs by the zones. The problem with zone blocking, I think that they figured out, is that IPs may be assigned to a specific country at some point in time, but eventually they change because they go back into a pool. So those IP addresses aren't always assigned to South America or something like that. So it's very difficult to tell where traffic comes from a software perspective or trying to block that. So usually you put things in place like WAFs or firewalls that then you could put geofencing around to say, I want to geo-block China, or I want to geo-block Russia, or things like that, to where you can stop people from coming through. But those are kind of more of a whitelisting fashion. And the only reason I don't use whitelisting is because whitelisting in our industry means that we physically put IP addresses into a file. And that can become a problem because, like I said, IP addresses are dynamic. So you may block some, but that may not be who owns the IP address tomorrow or a month from now.
So you're constantly maintaining it if you try to do whitelist, blacklist.
Right.
Okay.
So you kind of really look at it. The way I always tell people is like, look, even though it may be outside of it, put down in your software that you can only order this or you only deliver to the continental United States, right? So doing it a little bit of directing folks rather than doing sunk cost, because in Azure, a lot of people don't understand that everything costs money, right? Everything in the world costs money. Everything you snap on and everything you do costs money. So you don't want to do it in Azure unless you need to. So if you're looking at something like, you want to lock down credit card services or something like that, you could do that via HTTP. Then you could put something down that says, I only deliver domestically, which will preclude people from ordering. But you may get a footprint of knowing that, hey, maybe people from India want your stuff. So you may be able to increase market.
Well, people think about
there's things that help.
The bad actors. Is like, is there an automatic way to configure it so that somebody overseas doesn't just sit there and try to hack in? And
most of your hacking stuff is going to be covered by the Microsoft infrastructure, right? So when you talk about something like Azure or the cloud, a lot of the hacking portions are going to be taken away, but that's only infrastructure hacking. So you need to understand what's infrastructure, and you moved your purview, and then what's application. Now, when you're talking about exploiting your application where you're using a SQL injection or something, that's not going to be detectable by infrastructure. So that's going to have to be more of a code-based function. So when you look at things like that, you want to make sure that those are what the WAF firewalls do. So they'll start blocking IP addresses that are being mischievous. They'll start haircutting URLs that are coming in from the perspective of injecting or trying resource-based attacks or things like that. So there are things that you can bolt on over time to kind of fix these things.
Okay. Well, let's move to the web app configuration, because whether it's Azure Pipelines or Octopus Deploy, there's easy steps to say, hey, I've got a .NET web application. I've packaged it up. Here's a NuGet package. That's my release. And go ahead and deploy it to Azure, ARM. And then, and whether you configured it that way, then you can go into Azure and you can scale it up, pick a different instance type, or you can scale it out to, 2, 4, 6, however many instances you want. And then when you come back and do another deployment, it's going to be automatic. It's going to update every instance you have, which is the old node in a web farm. And so that's like the easy stuff. But one thing that a symptom that Azure doesn't do automatically is know when your application or one of your instances of the application is doing nothing but throwing exceptions. Your application's down. It thinks its node is healthy because, its server is healthy, but the application is not. So what, and that's not automatic. What do .NET developers have to do to let Azure know, hey, the application's unhealthy. You might want to take this instance offline and replace it?
Well, that's generally when you start looking at the difference between, native and sort of the guest features of when you look at things from an Azure perspective. I mean, tying in to understand how to use App Insights, we usually refer to those as hung states in Azure, to where
Mm-hmm.
the infrastructure is running, but the application's not. So it's in a hung state, which means the infrastructure is responding, but the application isn't responding. So looking for things like there's health check probes that you can put into that will run against the code base that will tell you whether your code is actually healthy and responding. Then there's App Insights levels to where you can have App Insights trap those errors, and then you could use something like Azure Monitor in order to send out alerts saying, hey, I've detected that there's problems in your application. You may want to go look at it. Or with that, you can use what they call the smart alerting that goes in there, to where you can tell the smart alerting, hey, if I see these type of alerts all the time, I have to restart the app engine, or the apps become unhealthy, I need to do this. So you can tell it to automatically do that, so it'll be more self-healing.
Mm-hmm.
So Azure has a whole lot of ways for you to do that. But most organizations don't go for the self-healing side because there's still a trust factor. I mean, when you really look at things, people don't trust things they can't touch or belong to other people, right? So it tends to be a trust factor sometimes with, whether they use an automatic feature to do that. For instance, at a client that I'm with now, one of the things that we ran into is we knew that when we hit this state, we always needed to restart this app service. So what we did was I said, okay, if we detect this type of error message, let's go ahead and restart the app service. Let's not send a ticket to get a guy to go out there and restart the app service, because he may be at
Mm-hmm.
home, got to log in, do all this stuff. Let's just tell the system, we know 100% of the time when this happens, we restart. So application, restart, then it launches the ticket after it restarts. So it launches its own ticket and then clears it up without somebody having to go in and do that. So, when you look at that, we cut probably about, I don't know, maybe an hour or 2 hours a month off of somebody's support line. So you can see where if you do this incrementally and you're able to digest it more, you can start eliminating the need for sinking all of this support time into something. And then you can look at going in now and using SWAT teams to correct the problem, because it's not normally how you react to the problem, but it's also how do you correct it. So
Mm-hmm.
it got companies to get more focused on being able to resolve problems than just reacting to them. So there's unique ways you can use Azure to do that.
Okay. All right. So that's the the monitoring for unhealth. Now let's talk about the auto scaling. Great. Hey, we got auto scaling. But then Azure asks you, okay, on what metric and what value would you like us to add another node or add another instance to your web app? And it gives you all these options, but there's no guidance whatsoever. It's like, whoa, no. When we need a new instance, add one. That's what the normal developer wants to be able to tell Azure to do, but they're like, well, what exact metric of CPU would you like us to check, or what amount of memory is okay? But there's got to be some experience to say, hey, unless you have a specific reason to do otherwise, normally you want to use which metrics?
Yep. And well, you get the funny one, because that's always the one that you walk back to that same developer and you go, develop me an app, and you start to walk away and he goes, but what type of app? And you go, exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
So you look at things, and I generally look at where the apps have pressure, right? And what I mean by that is, do they have CPU pressure? Do they have memory pressure? What is the resource pressure that causes me to trigger the next set of instances to come in? That may be that we have a tipping scale that says that after we have 50 concurrent users, we want to go ahead and do this. Or our app may be malperformant in retrospect to CPU, so you may want to scale at CPU, and the CPU hits about a certain percent. Then you go ahead and spin up another one to relieve that pressure and bring it back down. Or it may be, memory size. So you go in and look at applications that are very memory intensive, may need to spin up another one to relieve that memory pressure. So it really depends on the type of pressure that you look at. Most of what I've seen out there is has to do around CPU and memory pressure. So that's been the two biggest keys that I've seen where people have kicked off a majority of their auto scaling and things like that. The interesting part is when to descale. If you know what that means, to where you need to spin those things back down and bring them back in so that you can kind of expand and contract. Because even though you have instant spin-ups, there still is an amount of time that happens before those instances are ready to be introduced into the mix per se. So,
Okay. All right. So on SQL database, it's again, it's simple to set it up, simple to deploy. You can connect straight from SQL Management Studio if you need to do some, what's going on in the back end and all that. But then there's backups, which aren't terribly, there's settings of, okay, we'll retain some backups. But then, of course, any kind of person who's experienced with database is like, okay, great. I see that you say that you have some backups. Can you give me one so I can test it to make sure that the backups are good? That's not terribly obvious.
No, it's not. And one of the things that got me confused, when I started going out and they started ramping up this whole system was you have point in time, right? So when you go to a SQL database, you have a point in time backup. Okay, what does that mean, point in time? How do you configure that? And they say, well, it goes up to so many days. And then you have a weekly backup, and then you have a monthly backup, and then you have a yearly backup. Well, what are those? Are those differentials? Do they come in? So there's a lot that goes into that. And one of the things that threw me for a loop was when you do a restore, you don't really get to pick the name too much. So the restore then comes out to be a restore of a database that then in turn you have to copy over. So there's a bunch of things that I had to learn from the whole bringing things back and migrating data and doing this stuff from an Azure perspective. One of the things that we had to look at was what we referred to as sisters from a region perspective. So what we would do is we'd have our database in, say, Eastern US. And then what we do is we would keep a cold storage backup in Western US so that if East went down, we could actually spin up and restore from the West to another, like a Central or a West, to bring the site back up. So there's different strategies when you look at that. A lot of what Azure does is more from a distribution perspective. So you look at ASR, so you look at management groups, so you look at any one of the points from like distributive nature of SQL and Cosmos DB. They try to distribute to alleviate that problem so that they can switch to these databases. But for a lot of organizations out there, that cost is prohibitive, right? There's not a lot of mom and pops and small to medium sized businesses that are going to pay $250, $300 a month extra for each one of these distributed databases. So they have to come up with unique ways to try to solve that problem. So it's definitely interesting because of how you can solve it. There's not one size that fits all. You've got things that will back it up directly and keep a local store so that you can deploy it back out. Or like I said, you can use a cold storage module to where you ship your backups out to cold storage, and then you can restore them from there in another region. You can send them out to a OneDrive. You can do a whole bunch of different things. For storing your backups and things like that. So it really comes down to, what is your risk? How do you want to mitigate that risk? And how much money are you willing to allocate towards your disaster recovery plan? Now, I will say this. You need to put money in disaster recovery because people don't do that until the disaster comes. And that's not when you want to learn about disaster recovery, because it can be catastrophic for a lot of small to medium range businesses.
Well, speaking of that, what's the 80-20 rule? For example, you could say, oh, well, spin me up in a different region. Okay, there's been a few times when an entire region was having some big difficulties. I think that huge electrical storm in San Antonio was one of those. Exactly. No, I remember the storm. It came by our house. It was a pretty significant event, and it would have been fine. It would have been fine, except it fried one of the generators at the building, where the Azure data, the South Central was. And then the thing, it's running on a generator, and the generator can't keep up with the cooling. So then we go a little bit over in degrees, and then servers start auto shutting down because the temperature is a few degrees too high beyond the threshold that they were set at to be healthy. So the data center protected itself by shutting itself down. Which, in reality, if it hadn't have done that, then you would have started, frying boards, and then it would have been a lot bigger, longer recovery when you start really frying motherboards.
Right.
So, but anyway, let's just say your database goes down. I know we can't cover a whole region, maybe, or want to. We say, you know what, the database is down. Is there a configuration to, to auto switch over to something else, or do you have to reset a configuration file in the application?
Well, it's going to depend. See, that goes back to your 80-20 rule. What do you want to absorb? Sometimes, like in our scenarios where I told you that backup went to cold storage, we would spin up that cold storage backup and we would restore a database, which then we would have to repoint the applications over to that database. Or you have the distributive nature, which can be active failover or active, depending on how you distribute your backend data processing. So it can switch automatically to those. So there's kind of twofold. But again, that all comes at cost, right? So everything is focused around how much money do you want to spend on that? And that's going to be the bigger key. So I don't want to give the point of, yeah, you should probably do this. It's really how much risk you're wanting to go into. That what had happened in San Antonio was a perfect storm because Microsoft just happened to move a whole bunch of things to South Region because they were doing some updates, and it caused a whole perfect storm because it locked a whole bunch of things out that didn't happen before. So that perfect storm, I don't think is going to happen again because I think they learned from that as well. So when you look at things from the perspective of business, they're going to learn things as things go down. So you're going to sit down and go, what do I feel today is acceptable for me to lose? Is that an hour? Is that 30 minutes? Is that a day? And then when you figure out what that is, then you build the solutions around that. And then in turn, if it happens and you notice that it didn't work out for you, then you build the next solution after that. So being in Azure is going to be one of those things that day by day, you're going to change things as prices go up and down and things change and new things become available and other things become less costly. Because over time, everything's going to change. I mean, you and I both remember when Azure first came out and how much it cost compared to today.
Oh, it's so cheap today. And,
exactly.
Oh, can we talk about cost for a minute?
Yes,
because this is surprising so many people. One of their people will do something, and they've been given access to a subscription which is not their Visual Studio subscription, which has $150 a month or something.
Right.
If you have the premium level, which I would advocate. I don't know if you disagree, that anybody who employs developers needs to give them that Visual Studio subscription, which comes with the Azure credits, which is, you got your playground to learn Azure.
Yep.
Okay. So if you're in a subscription that's been set up for production, which is not your dev and test subscription, now it doesn't have a cap. You turn on something, maybe they don't quite understand what it's doing from a billing perspective. You go away for the weekend, come back a few weeks later, accounting gets a bill, and they like, okay, we need to switch from Azure. This is not sustainable.
We got to shut it down because they don't understand how to set budgets on those subscriptions, right? So you can stop overspend by either doing monitoring that tells you when your spend is going up, or you can do something like CloudMD or something like that to where you can monitor these sort of things, or you can put budgets on them that will shut them down.
Okay,
when they hit a certain point, you can put those in to shut your service down if that's what you see fit.
So let's talk about that, because typically at an organization, I've seen it very common that one person will create the subscription, set up the billing, and then give developers access to it.
Right.
So it seems like maybe at the subscription setup, should there be some default things that when setting up a subscription, putting in a credit card, that is the point where you, in your mind, you have a budget that you're thinking about.
Right.
It's like, oh, heck no, we can't go above this amount in this subscription. It was never my intention to do that.
Right.
But so what is the rule? What is the configuration that someone creating a new subscription should put in immediately just before they give people access to it?
I do several things. So first off is I do Azure Resource Management. So I go in and I cut off all the big things. So you can't make super big VMs. You can't do all of the stuff. There's Azure policies that say every night the VM shut down unless they're in an exclusion list. And then I'll set up budgets if it's a test or dev environment so that they don't get overspend. So there are a bunch of things that you can do. One I would suggest is set up management groups whenever you do. Set your management groups up for prod and non-prod so that way you can keep them segmented and put policies on each. So when you create a subscription and you dump it into the non-prod management group, it inherits all of the policies and things that you've set for non-production environments. And then your production one has that. And then don't allow your developers to randomly deploy. Everything gets deployed to production. Nothing gets set up in production, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do all that crap in your, lower end non-production environments, but everything has to be done through DevOps and prod so that it's managed. Everybody knows the costs and everybody can anticipate what it's going to be. And that's the way we do it. We don't allow any developers, any operations folks spin up anything that does not go through a DevOps pipeline so that we can control everything that goes into production. It's vented, it's looked at. There's a change management group that checks everything. The accounting folks know how to predict exactly what's coming out of it. So we don't have a lot of these surprise costs because, one of the things that bit a lot of people many moons ago was Cosmos DB. People were like, oh, look, it's serverless. It's awesome. Let me spin one up. Then they got $15,000 bills that month because they didn't understand. Yes, yeah. Because they didn't understand that every query costs money. And the funny thing about that was every time you run a query in Cosmos DB, it gives you back how much that query just cost. In the header, you should go look that up. It's the most hilarious thing. It'll tell you that this cost $1.30 to run this query.
Now it's gotten a lot cheaper, and there's a free tier right now.
Yeah.
So like on the free tier, is it feasible to develop and let's say have one tester just testing the application, keeping within the free tier?
You can. I generally find them not performant enough to really go. I mean, you can, but the problem behind it is then you start masking little problems, right? So you don't see that the performance is there because you assume the performance is going to be bad. So somebody's not really creating the performance around it that you would see. So if you had a decent sized app that's supposed to be performant, and then you saw a degrade in performance, you knew you could kick that back to the developers. So it's really hard for testers to do any sort of performance testing around that in order to give the developers the right feedback. So I try to stay away from free tiers as much as possible just because I know they come with their own caveats. Now, that's not to say people
They're
can't
severely
use them.
throttled.
Right. And, it can be tough. If you have one developer and one tester, maybe you can get away with it. If you have any sort of team, 2 or 3, probably not the best solution for you to jump into.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So. Cool. Well, man, we could go forever just digging in because there's so many things that are not automatic yet. There's so many things you still need to configure. So, and if you're sitting on the edge of your seat, listener, go read his book, Building Solutions in Azure, as well as the new Azure Security Guide. And Greg, thanks for coming on the show again. I appreciate it.
No problem, sir. It's great talking to you.
Awesome. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.